Today, I'm going to show you how to quadruple your frame rate for less than a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Stay tuned. A few months ago, somebody in the comments recommended that I download and check out Lossless Scaling. It's an app available on Steam that costs about $7. This app promises DLSS-style upscaling for every game and promises to do this with little to no loss in quality. This honestly intrigued me, and the fact that the app included frame generation made it well worth the $7 that they were charging for it. Unfortunately though, I couldn't get it to work. I fought with it and finally I gave up. That was until I decided to give it another shot and this time figured out what the problem was. And I have to admit, this is probably the best $7 I've ever spent on Steam. So that's what we're talking about today. But first, I gotta pay some bills. So check out today's sponsor. Is your copy of Windows 10 unactivated? Well, it doesn't have to be, because with today's sponsor, VIP SCD Key, you can get a valid Windows 10 license for under $20. Stop dealing with that stupid watermark on the desktop, the valid license for Windows 10. Also, with an activated copy of Windows 10, you can upgrade to Windows 11 for free. Just go to the link in the description below and pick up a valid Windows 10 license key. During checkout, use the code CYBERCPU for a 25% discount. Once you have your key, go to your activation settings in Windows 10 and click on the link that says Change Product Key. Enter the product key you just purchased and hit Activate. Now you don't have to deal with that stupid watermark that comes with running an unactivated copy of Windows 10. Now, on with the video. So one of the benefits to NVIDIA's RTX cards is DLSS. This is a technology that allows you to play games in a lower resolution, and then the GPU, through the assistance of machine learning, upscales the image to match your monitor's resolution. And you know what? This works really well. But the downside is that games have to be specifically written to take advantage of it. You can't just get a game that was made 10 years ago, like GTA 5, and enable DLSS. That's where the Lossless Scaling app comes in. What this app does is it captures the game, it does its magic to it, and then displays it on the screen for you. So, in the case of upscaling, you can take a game and play it at 1080, and then upscale it to 1440 and get similar performance as you would have gotten at 1080. But this app goes one step further and also adds support for frame generation. Essentially, your frame rate is based on the amount of frames that your GPU can display on the screen per second. What frame generation does is it tries to guess what's happening in between, say, frame A and frame B, and then it creates the middle frame and sticks it between them. So if your GPU is producing 30 frames a second and lossless scaling is generating a new frame in between each frame the GPU generates, then it essentially is displaying 60 frames a second on the screen, even though your GPU only has to do the work to generate 30 frames. In the Lossless Scaling app, it will allow you to generate up to 4 times the original frame rate. So if you're producing 30 FPS, you could potentially be displaying 120 FPS. Unfortunately though, the more frames that Lossless Scaling has to produce, the higher your latency becomes. This can make games feel kind of sluggish and hard to play, but we'll go more into that a little bit later. But ultimately though, this app functions extremely similar to a screen capture program. It's capturing your gameplay and say kind of like the way that OBS would do it, and then modifying the capture data and displaying it on the screen. It does all of this in real time, so it makes you feel as though the game is running at a higher resolution and a higher frame rate with exactly the same GPU. Now, because of the way this program works, I can't screen capture it like I normally would. So you're gonna have to bear with me, because we're gonna be doing most of this video by just recording the screen with a GoPro. I'm going to flip back and forth between screen recording and the GoPro while lossless scaling is running, because if I didn't, all you would see is the screen capture that lossless scaling originally sees and not the modified screen that lossless capture produces. So let's jump on the computer and play around with this thing. Okay, so to start out with, we have to download Lossless Scaling. Now, like I said, this is a program that is available on Steam for about $7, $6.99. So it's super cheap and it's worth every penny. I highly recommend it. However, before you really start playing with this program, we have to set up the game itself first because there's certain changes that we have to make within the game to make it work with Lossless Scaling. Now, for the example today, I'm going to be using Cyberpunk 2077 because it's a program that no matter how I set it up will not run at my monitor's refresh rate, which is 144 hertz. So the first thing we need to do is actually launch the game. So the game's going to take a second to launch, so I'm going to fire it up real quick, and then I will meet you once it's fired up into the game. Okay, so here we are in Cyberpunk. I've got a regular game save right here, and as you can see in the top corner, it's running at about 30 frames a second, which is about typical with the way the settings are set up right now. I have the settings set up relatively high, and it's currently running DLSS as well. So what we can do is we're gonna go ahead and hit escape so we can jump into the settings, and there's a few changes that we're gonna have to make. And as you can see, we can kind of go through my graphics settings right here. You can see I have ray tracing turned on. I have a lot of the graphics settings set to high. And this is way more than what this computer right here could normally play on a regular basis, especially since it's right now set to 3440 by 1440. And that's essentially one of the settings that we're going to need to change. But the primary one is this one right here where it says full screen. So you need to set this right here to windowed borderless. And this is really important. This was the problem that I had that stopped me from using this program originally. And then also, we're going to set our resolution down because there's no point in pushing 1440 if we have to. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this all the way down to 1080. So 1920 by 1080. We're going to go ahead and hit apply. Since it's windowed borderless, it has our game essentially in a window. So at this point, we can go ahead and drop back into the game. So we're going to go ahead and resume now. And as you can see, I'm sitting at about 64-ish. 62, 63, so we're about 60 frames a second right now. It drops down really close to 60 right here. So at 1080p, it essentially doubles my frame rate, but at the same time, it's just a little bitty window instead of it being, full screen. And that's what we want to do with lossless scaling. All right. Now, setting up your game to function in lossless scaling is pretty important. This is the stage that screwed me up originally and caused the program not to work. If you don't set the game to be windowed and borderless, then the program just won't work. As soon as you enable it, it will create a black screen and you won't be able to see your game. This is the problem that stopped me from doing a video earlier on this program. So let's jump back on the system and configure the program itself. Okay, so now that we're in a game, as you can see, we can't actually move our mouse out of the game in order to do what we want to do. So the way you do that is just by hitting Alt-Tab and you can jump into your regular Steam app right here. So from here, we're going to scroll down, we're going to click on Lossless Scaling, and we're going to go ahead and launch the program. And then we can minimize Steam. And once Lossless Scaling starts, you'll see that we have a lot of different settings right here. Now, we're not going to mess with frame generation right now. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for right now. What we're going to mess with is the actual scaling mode right now. So for the scaling mode, I typically leave it at auto. However, you can set it to custom and you can set your scaling factor if you want to. However, I'm not going to go into that in this video right here. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it to auto and let the program itself figure it out. And then for the aspect ratio, you can either have it set to full screen or to aspect ratio. By default, it's just set to aspect ratio. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that because if you don't do that, then what it does is it just stretches the 1080 screen across the monitor. Now, if you're using a monitor that is the same aspect ratio as 1080p, like if you're using a 1440 monitor that isn't an ultra wide, then you can go to full screen if you want to. However, on mine, it makes the game look really funny and stretched out. So I'm going to leave it at aspect ratio and it'll essentially put black bars across the side of the screen when it's playing the game. Now, for the scaling type, there's a couple of different options for scaling type. So the scaling type is essentially the protocol that you want to use for doing the upscaling in the first place. By default, it's set to LS1, which is the built-in scaling that comes with lossless scaling. However, you have a wide variety of other protocols that you could use. This includes AMD FSR as well as NVIDIA's scaling protocol. Here's an example of LS1 compared to AMD's FSR and NVIDIA. As you can see, all three are extremely close. Unfortunately, say, this was captured through a GoPro and isn't the best image, so it's hard to make out the differences. But I noticed that AMD's FSR and LS1 are pretty equally matched, and NVIDIA was a little blocky. However, when it comes to these scaling protocols, it's going to be a matter of preference. So let's jump back on the computer and I'll show you how to flip between each one so that you can decide which one's the best for you. So to start out with, we're just going to go to the LS1 protocol right here. And to start the actual scaling itself in the app, all we have to do is push the scale button right here and click on the app in the background. Now it's going to take a few seconds and you'll see it go full screen. And of course, I have to jump on the GoPro at this point because, you wouldn't be able to see the scaling otherwise. But as you can see, we have the black bars on both sides of the screen. And in the top corner right here, you can see the frame rate. Now we're not using frame generation at the moment, so we're only going to see the frame rate that we are getting all around. What this frame rate right here is for is, as you can see right here, it says 6262. Once we do frame generation, it'll tell what your actual frame rate is and what the generated frame rate is. And we'll get into more of that later. But as you can see, we're still running at 60 frames a second and we're upscaled to 1440 now. We're at least upscaled to the size of the monitor and the picture is pretty good and the response time actually is pretty good as well. So you can see I am losing a little bit. So as of right here, if I come out onto the street, you can see that I'm right around 62 still. So it's really close. It dropped to, oh, there we go. It's dropping to 50, 56, 57. So you lose a little bit of performance by doing it this way, but in the long run, you lose very little and you get a lot. You get 1440p. Now, if you want to switch between the different scaling methods, like say you want to try the AMD FSR, all you have to do is hit Alt-Tab to jump back into your lossless scaling. And then from here, you just go ahead and push the Unscale button and choose a different scale type. So we're going to go AMD FSR, and then we're going to go ahead and push Scale again, and we're going to let it do its thing. And you start it exactly the same way as you did before. And there we go. We jump back into it. And as you can see, this one is pretty close to the last one. And it doesn't really have, I didn't see much difference between AMD FSR and the LS1. I thought they were extremely close. However, I did see somewhat of a difference between the NVIDIA scaling and the AMD and LS1. Let me show you. So if we hit Alt-Tab again, we jump into NVIDIA image scaling, and then we go ahead and jump back into the game. And there we go, we jump back up. Now our frame rate is still the same. However, what I noticed was with the NVIDIA, it kind of shows, if we get real close onto objects, you'll see, I don't know if you'll be able to see this with the GoPro, but you'll see kind of blockiness in lines where it's not real crisp, sharp lines on things. And it's kind of blocky in certain places. And that's just an artifact of the upscaling itself. However, it was weird that the NVIDIA one would do that, but the AMD or the LS1 wouldn't. So if we were to jump back out, so go ahead and jump into AMD FSR, and jump here, it should switch over to that now. Now, as you can see, a lot of that blockiness is gone. Now, there's still a little bit, but not as much as there would have been if it was still on the NVIDIA protocol. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and jump back out here. We're gonna go ahead and unscale it again. And now we wanna play around with frame generation. Now, essentially what this does is just like I explained earlier, frame generation is going to put new frames in between the existing frames that you used before. So for this one, we're gonna go ahead and choose LSFG 2.3. And this is the newest one. So this is the new from the update from the app. So, and then we're going to leave it in X2 mode right now. What this means is it's going to essentially 2 times your frame rate. It's going to put in a new frame in between each frame that the GPU produces. And then also you can set it to performance. And what this will do is it'll help to lower the latency problems by essentially processing the frame generation a little bit quicker. But it is at the exception of quality. So it will be a slightly worse quality than it would have been if you would have left it off. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it off for right now. And then when it comes to clip cursor, all clip cursor is for is to kind of keep the cursor within the playable area of the screen. Because essentially what's happening is if you have multiple monitors, or if you have a game that's playing like you see here, that's just on the window here, that's borderless, then there could be a chance that your cursor could move outside of the playable area, and it could kind of mess up your gameplay. So by clipping the cursor, it keeps the cursor within the playable area. And then we scroll down here, we go down to sync mode. Now this thing right here supports G-Sync, and that's essentially one of the reasons you're going to want to use it. You essentially want this program to generate enough frames to where it brings the gameplay up to the refresh rate of your monitor. And in my case, that's 144 Hertz. It's going to try to bring the frame rate up to 144 frames a second to match my frame rate. So for the sync mode, I go ahead and leave that default. You can do half V-Sync and stuff like that, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave mine default. And then if we scroll down on this list right here, it also has draw FPS, and this is what gives us that little FPS counter in the top corner like I was showing you before. And you also have to make sure to turn G-Sync support on. By default, I think it's turned off. It is an experimental feature, so I think it's turned off by default. So now that we have all this set up, we can go ahead and push scale, jump back into the game, and then once the game goes full screen, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. All right, so there we go. And as you can see, it says that we're at 45 FPS is what we're generating, and we're actually putting onto the screen 94 FPS. Now, you probably noticed by now that we did have a slight drop in our regular frame rate. And that's because the GPU is what's actually generating these frames, but just not in the way that you think it is. It's still using GPU power in order to do the frame generation. And because of that, you lose a little bit of your normal frame rate. In this case, we lost about 10 frames a second in order to get 96 frames a second. But if we move around, as you can see, it is relatively easy to play, and the latency isn't bad at all. Now, let me actually switch to a different gun here. So with the gun right here, one of the things that I wanted to point out is the reticle in the middle of the screen. Now keep an eye on that. Hopefully you can see it. Let me try to get somewhere where it's good, or it has a good contrast. So now that we're on the ground right here, if you see the reticle, it looks fine. But if I move it back and forth, do you see those little, there's just these little things that kind of show up, these little like aberrations that show up around it. And also if I aim the gun itself, or if I have the gun up, you can see the tip of the gun is kind of ghosting a little bit. And essentially what the purpose of that is why it's doing that is because with the frame generation, it has to kind of guess what is happening between frames. So when it does that, sometimes it doesn't quite guess the way that it should. And because of that, you get some of those aberrations. Now, honestly, it's not that bad if you're really looking for it. Like if you're playing the game and you're actually looking at it, then you can see it. It's really apparent. However, if you actually go through and play the game, I noticed that I don't really see it when I play the game. I went through this and played this for a couple hours with this turned on just to enjoy the improved frame rate. And honestly, I really didn't notice these problems while I was actually playing the game. I only noticed them when I actually sat down to look at it to do the video and to see, you can definitely see it if you're looking for it. But if you're just playing, then a lot of times you don't notice that's happening. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and jump out, and as you remember, we set this thing originally to the X2 mode. Now we're going to go ahead and we're just going to jump all the way up into the X4 mode and jump back into the game. Now, as you can see, we're all the way up to 142, 143, 44. So it did bring it all the way to the refresh rate on my monitor. So G-Sync is working. However, when you move around, you probably tell that, I don't know if you can tell it on the screen itself, but everything seems kind of muddy. Everything's moving slower than it should. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this, but let's go ahead and put my mouse right here. See if you can see it on the camera right here. And what I'll do is I'm just going to hit the mouse and you'll see how long it takes to react on the screen. And you know, it's not bad, but there is just a slight amount of latency that's kind of slowing it up. To be honest with you, it's actually working really well. So right here, it's running at 140 frames a second, and I'm pretty happy with it. And it seems pretty good at this moment. However, it is now dropped down to 36 frames a second at normal gameplay. So that 36 frames a second is then being multiplied by 4 in order to get us to our 142 frames a second. But it has quadrupled its frame rate, unfortunately, to the expense of maybe a little bit of latency. So this app isn't perfect. Unfortunately, when it comes to upscaling and frame generation, the app is only working with what it sees on the screen. If this was programmed into the game itself, it might have some help predicting how it should go about upscaling and especially in its frame generation. But even though it's not perfect, it's definitely worth $7 and it definitely does exactly what it says it does. If you have a lower or mid-tier gaming system and you'd like to get just a little bit more FPS out of it, then this program will definitely help you out on that. I mean, I was able to play Cyberpunk with full RTX on at 1440p and get almost 100 FPS with a 3060. That's pretty good. And I spent quite a bit of time in that game and it was pretty playable. In fact, that may be the only way I play that game from this point forward. However, I also tried it out on a few different games like Red Dead Redemption 2, and I didn't have as great a result with those games. Now, the results weren't bad, but they just weren't as good, if that makes any sense. You know, Cyberpunk actually reacted a lot better to the program than Red Dead Redemption did. You're going to have to play with this program on a game-by-game basis. And you can also set up custom profiles for each individual game so that you don't need to configure or change settings between games. You can just set it and forget it for that specific game. Either way, this program is a great deal, and I would highly recommend picking it up and playing around with it yourself. But if you'd like to improve your gaming performance without spending any money at all, then check out this video where I show you how to overclock your GPU. Now, you're not going to double your frame rate, but if used in combination with this app, it could give you an even better frame rate. As always, you guys have a great day.